Tensions in the Middle East intensify every day as both sides continue their attacks. With the escalation of tensions, the vital crisis of the 2.3 million Palestinians trapped in the 360 square kilometers of Gaza has reached its peak in the war that has lasted for months. Gazans have suffered greatly due to the aggressive behavior of Hamas and Israel's refusal to agree to a ceasefire because of this behavior. As we know, Hamas has often endangered the security of health facilities without regard for its own people. Hamas has also irresponsibly occupied the homes, cars, and places of worship of the people of Gaza. If we add all these factors together, it is clear that Gazans do not have the strength to resist the recent escalation of attacks in Khan Yunis, and Israel's plans to invade Rafah by land have spread fear in the population of Gaza. The inhabitants of Gaza have finally realized that Hamas is not fighting for their good. International officials have held repeated mediation talks in Cairo to stop Israeli plans to attack the Egyptian border settlement. Countries such as Turkey, Qatar, and the United States have actively participated in these talks. Furthermore, Egypt's efforts and measures on the border partially delayed the Israeli operation in Rafah. However, the talks did not yield sufficient results. After the failure of the talks, Israel's airstrikes on Rafah upset all the balances of the agreement. Millions of people have now started a massive uprising in the settlement on the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip because they have nowhere to flee following the bombing of Rafah. According to media reports, Israeli and Palestinian riots have broken out in the border area between Rafah and Egypt, and images of gunshots and explosions near the border crossing have broken viewership records on social media. The unrest intensified after the death of a Gazan teenager while he was trying to collect humanitarian aid. One of the reasons for the chaos in the city was the flight of 4 main Hamas battalions from southern Gaza to Rafah. In response to this Hamas organization, IDF military units continued to bomb Gaza City on the border with Egypt. The city's inhabitants rebelled against the situation, and the reaction against both sides grew like an avalanche. Rafah residents and refugees call on both Israel and Hamas to reverse their policies. However, as neither side has taken positive steps towards the peace process, the Rafah humanitarian crisis is expected to continue in the coming period. After all this, the Gazans, who could no longer stand it, began a great uprising. This time, the uprising was not like in the summer months. This time, people saw the reality more clearly and began a great resistance against Hamas. The people began a great uprising. Gazans declared that they were fed up with Hamas's aggression and wanted to breathe a sigh of relief. To do this, the Gazans raided the Hamas tunnels. Hamas hid in the tunnels after the IDF caught them in the hospital, and today they were in trouble due to the anger of the people of Gaza. In this panic situation, Hamas did not know where to flee. Until today, Hamas had always told Gazans that it was fighting for them. But when Gazans realized the truth, things changed. Thus, the Gazans confiscated Hamas weapons. In this way, the people of Gaza demanded a ceasefire from everyone. At the same time, the population of Gaza began to reveal the location of the tunnels to the IDF. Hundreds of Hamas fighters have tried to flee to Lebanon out of fear. The Gazans also denounced the presence of Hezbollah weapons in the area, as they did not want more conflicts. The IDF has made great progress after this crisis. Now, Gazans are asking for everyone's help to achieve a ceasefire. As we see, the civilians are devastated after all the hardships they have gone through. There have been similar uprisings before, but Hamas has managed to deceive these people with various promises. This time, things are different. People want to build a safer future for their children. So Hamas has lost its credibility in the region. As we have seen, then, why have the Gazans not risen up until now? Hamas has oppressed the people of Gaza in many ways during its 17 years of rule. In particular, financial restrictions have limited the movements of Gaza's population. For this reason, the population has been forced to live under the Hamas regime. In the midst of all these hardships, Gazans remained silent to protect their families. After all this, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that negotiations to reach a ceasefire and hostage release agreement have reached an impasse. As fed up as the Gazans, Hamas is not optimistic about any positive steps from Israel. Netanyahu said he was advancing plans for a ground assault on the Gazan city of Rafah, despite growing international warnings about possible humanitarian attacks. Both Hamas and Israeli delegations visited Cairo this week to try to advance a possible agreement in the indirect talks. Neither party sits down with the other. Instead, mediators like Qatar and Egypt act as intermediaries, sending messages back and forth. Netanyahu explained that Hamas refused to make concessions in the recent indirect talks in Cairo, mediated by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States. This mutual refusal to make concessions is forcing the people of Gaza to endure the current difficult conditions. Netanyahu also announced that Israel will not give up its intention to occupy the southern Gaza city of Rafah. In Rafah, some 1.4 million people currently live in overcrowded homes, schools, and tent camps near the Egyptian border. Israel has been bombing the city with airstrikes since the start of the war, but has not yet deployed ground troops there. A ground attack against this area would deliberately cause the massacre of thousands of people. It is imperative that Hamas and Israel find a middle ground as soon as possible. Netanyahu reiterated his promise to evacuate civilians to safe areas first. At the same time, Netanyahu suggested there was plenty of space north of Rafah from which they could be evacuated. Netanyahu acknowledged that the entire ground invasion plan had provoked a lot of opposition abroad. Netanyahu believes that those who want to prevent him from operating in Rafah want him to lose the war. In reality, it should be less about a show of force and more about ensuring the safety of the population. At the end of the day, Israel started this war to ensure the safety of its own people, and right now, it is about the safety of thousands of people living in Gaza. Netanyahu, despite all the criticism, said, "We will not give in to any pressure." We will not give in because we are a heroic nation. Netanyahu's firm stance on the ceasefire is causing a mass exodus and unrest in Rafah. For this reason, families who barely had time to set up their tents in Rafah on the Egyptian border are already packing their bags. In other words, Gaza residents in Rafah were preparing for another mass exodus. The UN spokesman, Stefan Dujarric, informed journalists of the movements registered towards Deir al-Balah, about 16 kilometers north of Rafah. UN humanitarian officials have reported that Palestinians in the southern Gaza city of Rafah have been displaced from this area towards central areas around Deir al-Balah as intensified Israeli airstrikes continue. Dujarric also stressed that frequent border closures, long-term restrictions on the import of goods into Gaza, damage to critical infrastructure, and the security situation have disrupted the delivery of aid throughout Gaza.